Hello, I am Suzanne Hilser-Wells, President of GG&A, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the latest edition of our Thought Leadership Series. If you have questions during our presentation today, please submit them via the Q&A button at the bottom or top of your screen. We won't have time to answer questions during the session, but we will post responses in the coming days. I am joined today by my colleagues, Angela Greenwald and Rod Kirsch, to discuss the critical roles volunteers play in fundraising success. In addition to serving as a GG&A consultant, Angela is a senior managing director at Duke University, where she leads a team of fundraisers who serve over 25 institutes, initiatives, and centers across campus. Rod Kirsch joined the firm after a decades-long career in fundraising, culminating in 20 years at Penn State, where he served as senior vice president and led the university through 2 multi-billion-dollar campaigns. Angela and Rod were major contributors to our summer 2021 playbook focused on leveraging volunteers. Welcome, Rod and Angela.
Yeah.
And for those of you who haven't seen the playbook yet, Damien, our tech support here from our marketing team, is going to include a link in the chat button for everyone to see. So I'm going to start out by pointing out that we know volunteers are far more likely to support an institution with a gift. And yet we regularly hear from our clients that they are anxious about engaging volunteers because they are a lot of work, which of course is true. So Angela and Rod, I'm going to ask you, what are 1 or 2 things you would recommend to leaders that they do as they either form leadership committees or recruit new volunteers to get these relationships set up for success and to make sure that effort, which is going to be great, is worth it? Angela, what advice would you give to our listeners?
Sure, happy to answer that. It's a great question. When I work with academic leaders who are contemplating or in the midst of board building, I always advise them to be extremely clear with themselves about their objectives. So, if you're setting up a volunteer committee or a board only because you need to generate revenue, that just is not going to be enough of an objective for it to be a meaningful, productive experience for the volunteer, which I think ultimately then works against your fundraising objectives. I often encourage leaders to consider other ways that they might benefit from the expertise of a diversity of perspectives that a board or a volunteer committee can bring. So in addition to being clear, I think, with yourself as a leader about what you hope to gain, I think it's also really important to be clear about what you're prepared to give. We all know that it requires a great deal of time. And I think if there are concerns about management, I'm always advising leaders to really assess before they get into this how much time they can realistically dedicate each week to connect with volunteers, to do the work of board management and building. And then if they can find time, to really block and protect that time on their calendars. I truly believe that relationship building will not happen if you don't carve out the time. Every leader is busy. And if you can divide it up into manageable segments, you can really keep it from becoming overwhelming and get into the practice really of relationship management and relationship building. And then when those relationships become strong and fundraising also becomes a lot easier. So those are some of the pieces of advice I give to leaders contemplating building volunteer committees.
Thank you, Angela. And I think I like what you described as being intentional about how much time you're going to carve out. So then you're making sure that the effort that you're putting in is also proportionate to what you expect to get out of it. Thank you so much. Rod, what would you add to that?
Well, a few things. First of all, I always encourage, particularly if you've not worked with volunteers before, or you're just building a volunteer culture, is to start modestly. Don't try to recruit 20 people to a committee. Start with 6 or 8, and get your sea legs, if you will. Get your footing on it. Be clear when you're recruiting on expectations. That includes time. That includes, if there's a gift commitment, that includes that piece of it, with the kind of tasks that somebody might take on. So being clear about responsibilities and expectations, very important. I actually am on the board of a fairly small nonprofit that every year we actually, as part of our board membership, we actually sign a document that asks us to take on several different tasks. I mean, it's kind of an optional, not signing the document is an optional, but the tasks are, kind of multiple choice. And I found that to be a really great practice. The other thing I'd say about recruiting volunteers is that, because we really are in the business of raising money for the most part, and most people listening here probably are, I often find that sometimes volunteers just say, I'll do anything, but don't ask me to ask others for money. And I think we need to be able to explain that there's a lot of ways that volunteers can help an organization raise money without necessarily being the one in the room that asks for a gift. I do, and I teach on volunteer management and so forth. I've got kind of a list of 10 things that I go through that are ways that can be helpful without actually asking somebody for a commitment. So those are some of the things that would come to my mind, I guess. The other thing, I think it's been helpful for me to be a volunteer myself. So it's hard to ask somebody else to walk in those shoes unless I've done it. And I've learned a whole lot actually about working with volunteers and volunteer management and even recruiting volunteers by being a volunteer myself.
Yeah. I love your example from the place where you serve as a volunteer leader, Rod, because I think often as Angela and Rod and I and others at the firm work with our clients, a lot of the tension we see between volunteer leadership groups and staff is the undergirding problem is this lack of clear and consistent communication around expectations. And so I think that's incredibly important that we're clear, we're transparent, we're consistent. And that is really foundational to the success of these programs. So I'm going to turn to the end of volunteer management and service now. We sometimes hear from volunteers that once they step down from a board or a significant committee, they'll end up feeling disconnected from the institution. They go from being integral to the work to feeling really disconnected from what's happening at the institution. Rod, what are some things you think that institutions can do to end service well and keep those individuals engaged beyond their active board service?
Yeah, so some of this I think that a volunteer actually can help carry the water on and help us as staff. And so, I actually had a campaign chair that this was over the course of the context of a 7-year campaign that actually into the beginning of the 3rd year essentially said to everybody, we're going to have some rotation on leadership here, give others a chance to serve the institution. And start to think about who your replacement might be and begin to talk to staff about that. And so there was some natural evolution, and just about every chair, committee chair and so forth, changed seats, if you will, during the course of that campaign, which I thought was really healthy. When I was at Penn State, one of the things we did at the end of a campaign, because we at that point in time had many people who had been volunteers for like 20 plus years. And one of the reasons people volunteer is to meet others. They form business relationships. They enjoy the social interchange and so forth. And obviously they care about the institution. But you need to find some way, but many of them are kind of tired sitting through committee meetings and taking on assignments. So you need to find some connective tissue here to bring them, still make them feel like they're really kind of a heart of the institution. So we created at the end of the first campaign I did at Penn State, we created something called presidential counselors. And they were a group that met twice a year at the president's house over brunch. There was kind of a 90-minute session, get an update on the university, a Q&A with the president. Then we had brunch and they went on their merry way. There wasn't responsibilities. Sometimes we would give them reading materials in advance, but I think that's one way to kind of keep them engaged, but not necessarily in a way where they have to do things. I do think it's it can be really a challenge when people leave a board and they're not appropriately thanked, and even if they're willing to leave and so forth. So institutions really need to be mindful of that. so that there's public recognition of someone's service. And I think one way where staff can be helpful with this is if there's been a long-serving volunteer, a new chair of a committee or a chair of a board might not actually know the history of some people that are now stepping aside and giving up their spot. And so it's up to staff, I think, to remind some of our volunteer leadership that, you know, Sally's been here for 25 years and she has done X, Y, and Z and so forth. And so we publicly actually recognize these people. There are some people that love to collect mementos, have something on their wall. It doesn't cost much to have a certificate of appreciation, to give something, you know, also some tangible recognition for their service, you know. So I think there are some, you know, some good ways to ease that transition, so forth.
Thanks, Rod. That's really helpful. And I loved your reminder that these board members might not just miss being more connected to the institution, they actually miss being more connected to each other. So how can we help facilitate that community, which again serves our institution well at the end too. So Angela, sometimes institutions need to move an individual off a board or choose not to renew their board membership. And I know you deal with a lot of volunteer committees in your job. So what advice would you give to people listening today who might be in that situation?
Sure. Yeah, this is a situation no one ever wants to have to deal with, but it happens. And I think the most important thing to remember if this is a situation you find yourself in is that there is inevitably going to be, you know, a certain amount of discomfort in that conversation or the process, but it's usually, in my experience, it's not as awful as you might imagine it to be. And I think back on experiences that I've had where, you know, a board member or a volunteer wasn't a good fit. I've had situations where a volunteer was being incredibly disruptive, but in fact, we addressed the situation and we rectified it and the person continued to serve in a volunteer leader capacity. So I think the most important thing is that you have to approach the conversation with empathy and transparency. And oftentimes it's sort of if you're in a situation where the fit isn't right, where the board member is not a great fit for the board, say, it actually can be a relief for the board member to have this conversation with you, because I have yet to meet a volunteer who can afford to spend their time on something that is not working well, right? So it's usually not a surprise. There's usually shared feelings of frustration or ambivalence or lack of connection that, you know, it's just best to address them head on in an empathetic and transparent way, and you'll make it through just fine. So it's best not to avoid these situations, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And I think, you know, the second thought I have on this front is that this situation alone should be impetus enough for you to get your board governance documents and process in order. I think when you're able to fall back on an organizational process and requirements, as Rod referenced, for volunteer work, it gives you some additional cover and reasoning if you happen to have to make this hard decision where you've got to ask someone to step off, or, you know, you choose not to renew their term, or things aren't working. I think if you can fall back on process, that's a really good thing to have in place. So I always urge people to ensure first and foremost that they have those board governance processes in place that they can use should the situation arise.
Yeah, that's really helpful, and I think you're right. That clarity that can help you in the beginning of the relationship also enables you to have that conversation that you just referenced, which, in my experience, like yours, often it is there's mutual feelings about the tension or not being a great fit, and if you're able to point to something that clearly has articulated the institution's expectations and the support the institution will offer to that board or committee member, it's a much easier conversation. Then you realize we thought we had agreement, this isn't working out the way that we thought, and it's a much easier conversation to have. So that's really good advice. So anyone listening out there who does not have a written remit for your major committees and boards, do it today. You will be so happy you did.
And I would just add, Suzanne, that I think Just because a relationship isn't working out in one given volunteer context does not mean that it couldn't be successful elsewhere. I mean, I've also had conversations with board members who, we work together to find a better fit for them because they are terrific volunteers, but for whatever reason, or down the line when they have more time and bandwidth. So it's not the end of that person's volunteer sort of commitment or effort. It can be a time to pivot and re-examine really what they have capacity and or interest in. So it can be a positive thing too.
Yeah, no, that's a really important point. This is a real stewardship moment with these folks. Rod pointed out, like, let's not forget to celebrate, and sometimes we do, but also if we are having a difficult conversation, or even if the person is choosing to leave, to be able to really listen to them and then reflect back on how you try and engage them going forward. This is a time to deepen that relationship, no matter the circumstance for why it's ending. So Rod, sometimes we see individuals who really want a volunteer assignment, but institutional leaders don't see that as the right bet. For example, sometimes we as vice presidents of advancement have been told by somebody, I really want to be on the board. And the committee on trustees tells you that person is not being considered for board membership. So I'm sure we have people on this call who are facing that right now. What are some pieces of advice you'd give to people who are in that situation?
So you saved the easy one for me, right? That is, and I have actually been in that situation a few times over
I'm sure you have.
the course of my career. So there's a few things. I mean, again, with most things in life, honesty is the best policy. What I've tried to do in the situations that I recall now is that it's useful, I think, to explain to this eager volunteer that wants to be on the governing board or what the kind of, essentially how the governing structure works. Many governing boards, first of all, rarely have open spots. And if they do, there are certain committees or there's certain channels that you're either qualified for or not, just based on how you get onto a board. Some boards are very, university governing boards at public universities can be 8 or 9 people, tend to be a little bit larger at private universities. But so I try to explain just, first of all, how it works, and then really talk, as delicately but as candidly as possible about the kind of profile that a board is looking for. And oftentimes, I mean, if you have some certainty that this person's just not going to ascend to being on a governing board or whatever the situation is, I mean, I think explaining the profile that the board is trying to look for, it could be, it could be a certain skill set, it could be something related to diversity of the board. It could be, some kind of historical background they bring. I mean, it's a variety of things, but trying to explain in a way that says, the board is looking for this, and particularly if it's clear that the person doesn't have what the board is looking for. So that's what I've tried to do in the past. It's a very, and I like Angela's idea, kind of where she was talking about trying to find another place, position for somebody who's really enthusiastic and likely very supportive of your institution to is there something else of importance beyond just being a member of the governing board? And the other thing is, being a member of the governing board, I don't think is nearly as much fun as being a fundraising volunteer. So sometimes people really need to kind of understand what's really all involved with that, and the work that's involved, and the politics, and everything else as well. So.
I worked for a public university. I had a wonderful board member who would talk to people about exactly those things, Ron. What does it actually take to become a member of this public university board? What kind of disclosures? And in fact, he was very effective in dissuading some people from believing they wanted to be board members. So he was a terrific ally, and I'm sure you've worked with board members too who are willing to have those conversations with folks to kind of back up the advancement team.
It's really helpful. I mean, I'm going back to where we were talking with Angela a bit ago about, how do we shift somebody off of a committee? And it's really helpful, again, I think, if a volunteer can have that conversation. I have two instances that come to mind quickly. I had a vice chair of a campaign that had responsibility for a number of committee chairs. Essentially, we say, well, we never fire a volunteer. Well, this vice chair of the campaign actually did fire a volunteer.
Oh, wow.
And the person probably deserved to be fired because the person had not come to meetings, had not made a gift, all the traditional boxes. And so fortunately I had a volunteer that was willing to sit down and say, this just isn't working for us as a committee. It's not working for the institution. And, thank you for originally agreeing to serve, but, we're going to find somebody else to fill the spot.
Yeah.
And I had a different case, a different volunteer that this is almost a different, where somebody was staying on too long and we needed to just make a transition.
Mhm.
And again, a volunteer was willing to have that conversation to talk about, giving other people a chance to serve and needing to have, new faces, fresh faces, whatever the case might be. So I think, I'm a huge proponent of volunteers.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes they can help us, the staff doesn't have to figure out every single, solution. I think sometimes volunteers can.
No, it's a great point. And it's interesting you mentioned the committee didn't think this necessarily was working. One of our, as you both know well, one of the tools we often use at a kind of a critical moment in a campaign is a survey to volunteers to find out, are our expectations meeting yours? And sometimes there are a couple of people who've got some big ideas about how we should be supporting volunteers that we can't do. We're able then to mirror back and say, this is actually what most of you say is important, what most of you are looking for in a volunteer experience, and that we can support. That's another, I think, tool, like let the crowd speak, and us respond to those things so people feel appreciated and heard, but also it can help us when we have people with big opinions that are maybe not as widely held as they believe.
Yeah. Yeah.
So Angela, you work with lots of volunteer committees across your campus, and we hear these groups talked about as pipeline builders for board members and philanthropy. How do you make that an actual practice and not just an intention?
That's a hard question. Well, I think, my experience at Duke, this is a work in progress, but I think where we have to start is really focusing on fundraising and engagement education. So we place a very high priority on training and equipping our fundraising and engagement staff with the tools they need to really understand the various levers they can pull for engagement of prospective board members and donors and volunteers. So they're the relationship builders, right? And so if they understand the levers they can pull for engagement and the full spectrum of opportunity for our volunteers, and when I say the full spectrum, I mean interviewing prospective students, mentoring students, hosting an event, volunteering for your reunion, serving on a board. Sometimes I think we just immediately go to boards and committees rather than recognizing that volunteer engagement can mean many different kinds of things. And so we talk with our fundraising and engagement staff really about what's available, what the criteria for these volunteer opportunities are, what does the profile of a board member look like? What did they do 10 years ago or 15 years ago at the institution? And can we see how they've built that engagement over time to sort of really build that pipeline for board service? Most people don't show up at Duke anyway and just sit on a board, right? They have years and years of past volunteer engagement. That's not necessarily board service. So really demonstrating to those relationship builders on campus how they can leverage volunteer experience to build toward board is one way, I think, to put this into actual practice. And I work with a lot of development directors who oversee these boards and committees, and I talk to them frequently about their responsibility to prepare their current volunteers, their current board members for the next opportunity. So they're with you right now, but what are they going to do after their 2 board terms are complete? And you have a responsibility to be a partner in helping them find the next thing at the institution, if that's what they want, right? And I asked that question pretty directly, and we may yet work toward formalizing some of that process around making sure that we look at, in the 15 plus boards that I work with, who's rotating off in the next couple of years, and what is our strategy for their next step at Duke. So that's one way to put it into practice. I think another big way to make pipeline building for engagement and philanthropy an actual practice is it's something we've done at Duke, and this is a work in progress, but we recently merged our fundraising and engagement teams into one organization with one team, shared goals, integrated teams. And that's a pretty extreme way to make something become very real very quickly. And we're not the first university to do this, or even close to the first, but I can see already, even within the last 9 months, that it is going to redefine our approach to lifelong engagement and that pipeline of engagement that leads to board membership and growing philanthropy. We're building new platforms for engagement that we can offer to our alumni. We want to see this as a reciprocal relationship. What can we give them, and also what can we ask from them? Because they have a tremendous reservoir of talent and experience that we can draw on to advance any number of institutional priorities and ambitions that may not, and when we say we need their time, we don't necessarily mean just on boards, right? So we have to think about it more comprehensively. So integrating your engagement and fundraising teams can also be a very practical way to change the culture around, building a pipeline of volunteers in a meaningful way that it's comprehensive.
That's great. And, I think for those of our listeners who maybe aren't at institutions that are as large or as well staffed as Duke, the intentionality of that, whether or not there's a formal process, formal structure, is an important takeaway, that we're thinking about almost like career pathing for some of these folks that we see as, leaders now, but really future leaders, perhaps board members later on. So that's great. And to engage your whole team, and how do we build their skills and experience so that they're ready for that?
Right.
It's terrific advice. We are at the end of our time together. I want to thank Rod and Angela for their really helpful advice and for answering those not so easy questions along the way. Thanks to the GG&A team that produces these webinars, and thanks to all of you for joining us. Again, please submit any questions you have either via the Q&A button on your screen now or our website. I also invite you to connect with me, Angela, Rod, or GG&A on LinkedIn. And if you haven't downloaded our playbook, please do so. Again, thank you all so much for joining us, and have a great day.